Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Glancy, Professor of Religious Studies and McDevitt Core Professor. I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's lecture by Professor Heidi Ravven, Becoming at Home in the Universe, as well as in Our Own Skin. This lecture is in a series on the future of being human. The series will run each semester through 2017. It's my privilege as the McDevitt Core Professor to organize the series, sponsored by the McDevitt Center in conjunction with a course on the future of being human that I am co-teaching this semester with Sean Lohner. And here's the blurb for the course. In light of ecological crisis, rapid technological change, and widespread social alienation, what is the future of being human? This transdisciplinary course invites students to join a conversation about what it means to be human in the 21st century, a conversation also incorporating voices of theologians, philosophers, scholars of religion, fiction writers, literary critics, and natural and social scientists. Through your attendance tonight, you have also become part of this vital and ongoing conversation. The public lecture series this semester includes a great lineup, including on March 14th, Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Tracy K. Smith, whose memoir Ordinary Light was a finalist for the 2015 National Book Award in the nonfiction category. On April 11th, we will hear from Ben Dunning of Fordham's Theology Department. Dunning's research draws on ancient Christian sources to pose questions about gender and the future of humanity. I'd like to publicly acknowledge the support of the team of the McDevitt Center team. Stephen Offeld has been steadfast in his commitment to this project. These events would not take place, and you would not hear about them without the tireless work of Kate Hennigan. Tonight's speaker is Professor Heidi Ravven, who has been on the faculty of Hamilton College since 1983. With a PhD from Brandeis University, Professor Ravven is a neurophilosopher and specialist on the philosophy of the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza. She was the first philosopher to propose that Spinoza anticipated central discoveries in the neuroscience of the emotions. She has published widely on Spinoza's philosophic thought, on the 12th century philosopher Moses Maimonides, on Hegel and feminism, and on Jewish ethics and on Jewish feminism. In 2004, Professor Ravven received an unsolicited $500,000 grant from the Ford Foundation to write a book, Rethinking Ethics. And so for those of you academics in the crowd, I just want you to pause and sort of revel in that fantasy moment. To have someone, a prestigious foundation, approach you with that kind of gift and say, as I understand it, use this to deepen your own work and to make sure that it reaches the broadest possible audience and has the greatest possible impact. So what a great fantasy moment, and I'm really glad to be part of it by proxy. Professor Ravven made good use, excellent use of her opportunity. Her book, The Self Beyond Itself, An Alternative History of Ethics, the New Brain Sciences, and the Myth of Free Will, is an extended and multidisciplinary inquiry into moral agency, why we are moral, why and when we are not, and how to get people to be more moral. Professor Ravven is a fellow in neurophilosophy with the Integrative Neurosciences Research Program. She is a member of the Atrocity Prevention Study Group. She has advised, for example, the UN Sustainability. She's been an advisor to Jeff Sachs, who chairs the UN Sustainable Development Committee. All right, sorry. I really want to thank Professor Ravven for accepting the invitation tonight. For me, her research exemplifies the potential of interdisciplinary research that we're also modeling in this course and in this series. So thank you, Professor Ravven, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jennifer Glancy and the McDevitt Center. It is an extraordinary honor to be here, and I am truly delighted and very excited to be here. It's a great honor today to speak about the human future, a topic which is overwhelming. And I thought, what do I have to really contribute to that? And I'll give it my best shot to think about it a little bit. And of course, it's a vital concern to us all, and is at the back of our thoughts at all times. And I'm hoping to bring the issue of the human future to the fore for an hour or so today. So my topic is becoming at home in the universe, as well as in our own skin, insights from the new brain sciences and from Spinoza. So I want to begin with some thoughts on just where we are in this universe. Are we divided against ourselves, a mind in perpetual rebellion against a wayward body, and a body inherently desirous of those things that our mind tells us to resist? Is temptation the fate of being human? Can we envision a human future in which our internal bodily and mental spiritual nature is unified, and our belonging in the universe is a fundamental goal, so that our well-being and that of what we usually refer to as the natural world, as if we were not part of it, reinforce each other in ecological balance and harmony? Don't we now know, given the threat and beginning real effects and experiences of global climate change, that the very survival of a human future on this planet depends upon just such an embrace of nature, our inner nature, as well as planetary and universal nature? Yet are we then mere animals, with little control over our fate within the massive forces of weather and geology, and even biology, psychology, and physiology? In the Bible, in the Psalms, this tension is described as lying between human inconsequentiality. We are a mere blip in time. Our days are but a passing shadow, Psalm 144 tells us, within the vastness of the universe. And on the other hand, there are our special gifts. As the psalmist writes, Adonai ma adam v'tida'ehu, ben enosh v'tachashvehu, adam lehevel dama, yamav ketzel over. And I'll translate in a minute. For at the same time as our infinitesimalness, the human person displays greatness and even glory. The psalmist speaks out to God, saying, Psalm 8, when I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars that you, God, set in place. What is man that you are mindful of him? Mortal man that you have taken note of him. Yet you have made him little less than the divine and adorned him with glory and majesty. How can we account for human potential and yet understand ourselves to be within the vastness of nature, of the universe, a scale of vastness now being discovered to be beyond anything imaginable to the psalmist, yet grasped by the biblical author in principle nonetheless? How can we reconcile our full naturalness, our Darwinian origins, our origination in variation, diversification, and complexification, as Elizabeth Gross, in Becoming Undone, Darwinian Reflections on Life, Politics, and Art, has brilliantly described it, and our composition, like everything else in the universe, by stardust? How can we reconcile that with our capacity for self-awareness of just that? Astronomers' common observational wisdom is that there are 17 billion Earth-sized planets in our own galaxy alone, the Milky Way. 17 billion. The sun is about 1,400,000 kilometers wide. The Milky Way is 100,000 light years in diameter. That means 950 followed by 25 zeros kilometers wide. According to the Hubble Space Telescope, there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, and ours is not even a big one. And each galaxy contains billions of stars, most with planets orbiting them. The sun is 1.4 times 10 to the 27th cubic meters in volume, yet it's puny compared with some others. There are stars that are 2.9 billion times the size of our sun in volume. How do we come to understand ourselves, really become self-aware in terms of this vastness? How can we develop a self that sees ourselves in true proportion and in true context? Yet, as far as we know right now, in our own known world and experience, and in the astronomy that has come to light, as far as we know, we human beings alone can have this awareness. So far. What's the advantage? Is there one? Are there many? In the very act of the recognition of our ephemeralness beyond ephemeralness, in the vastness and eternity of time, space, and nature, we begin to see both our glory and perhaps our tragedy. Our self-awareness confronts us with the scale of our smallness and brevity, but the very possibility of knowing this, of being self-aware in this way, is beyond anything else we know of in the universe. For in the tiny dot in the corner of the universe that we inhabit, at this brief split second in universal time, we alone, as far as we know, are fully, or at least potentially, fully self-aware. At least that's our existential reality. For we alone can grasp our position and our fate, individual and collective and terrestrial. We realize that it is in this interim and in this locale wherein we reside. And we can affect this little spot and moment, our home, for good, but of course also for bad. And we have. For news out recently, for example, is that 2015 shattered 2014's record as the hottest year ever recorded since 1880 on Earth, according to NASA and NOAA. Some people are now referring to the geologic epoch on Earth we are now in since the mid-20th century as the Anthropocene epoch in the geologic time scale, because of the scale and range of change introduced into planet Earth by human activity. So we are confronted with the question of how to make the best use of it. How can our self-awareness make a difference for ourselves, for our descendants, and for the Earth upon which our human survival and future depends? And of course, like most things that I do, it all goes back to Spinoza. Okay, so enter Spinoza. The 17th century Dutch Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza believed that a turn inward in conscious self-reflection in order to understand ourselves, our unique experiences, and our unique time and place within the context of the entire universe, from time immemorial and toward time infinite, offers human beings their only possibility of freedom, and even of a fulfilling life. Recognizing ourselves in the world and the world within us, he proposed, enables us to engage in passionate pursuits in wider and wider domains that have now become our own, dimensions of our very selves. As a result, our motives towards others and toward the wider world are transformed from self-serving to benevolent and responsible, he thought. In one of his two major books, the one he called his Ethics, the other one is his theological political treatise. In the Ethics, he wrote that the proper training of the mind in self-understanding can bring it about that, quote, the good which every person who pursues virtue aims at for him or herself he will also desire for the rest of humankind. I propose in this talk that discoveries in the new brain sciences may be proving Spinoza right. So let's talk about Spinoza. Spinoza tells us that there are only two ways that we can understand our world and our experience. And this is what he says, quote, either insofar as we conceive things to exist Either insofar as we conceive things to exist in relation to a certain time and place, or insofar as we conceive them to be contained in nature as a whole, and to follow from the necessity of nature. The contrast Spinoza is drawing is between a local perspective and the universal infinite perspective. He gives a more detailed description, too, in the Ethics, and this is what he says there. The mind has only a confused knowledge of itself, of its own body, and of external bodies so long as it perceives things from the common order of nature. That is, so long as it is determined externally from fortuitous encounters with things, and not so long as it is determined internally, for so often as it is disposed internally, then it regards things clearly and distinctly. I'll go on to try to unpack that and see if we can make some sense of it. What that means is, in the local perspective, the links that fill our grasp of self and world are picked up passively by the mind from the ways that what Spinoza calls the common order of nature, but what he means by that is the local context, connects or associates things with each other and ourselves with and within our immediate world, our time and our locale. We are subject to weakness of mind, Spinoza says, when we merely reflect our embeddedness in our immediate external circumstances, our narrow context, and as a result, we let the world write itself unreflectively upon our mind, filling our minds with simple mental associations. That, he says, is only who we superficially are rather than who we really are and who we really can be once we engage in ongoing self-reflection and reflection upon the larger world of which we are a tiny part. That's what he means by having our minds and thoughts determined internally, that is, self-reflectively. The first kind of life, the unreflective one, originates in an uncritical adoption of the world one is born into, of its meanings and aims, culture, language, and attitudes, hopes and fears, along with the arbitrariness and idiosyncrasies of personal experience and formative relationships. All these shape our goals and aspirations, our sense of ourselves, and even our pleasures and aversions. They control us, he said. We do not control them. So the problem is both cognitive and also emotional and motivational. For when a person, quote, follows the common order of nature and obeys it, Spinoza writes, he also accommodates himself to it as far as the nature of things demands, unquote. So our unreflective and passive acceptance of our own corner of the world, our own moment, and of our narrow experiences has emotional and motivational implications. For conceiving ourselves and our context in such local terms fills us with desires that do not really fulfill us, he says, nor do they even achieve what they aim at, namely our well-being and our freedom. Spinoza was the first modern philosopher, I think, to have freedom as a goal. We take it for granted, but he was one of the inventors in modernity of that goal of life. Our uncritical acceptance of our local external world and of the worldviews of those around us is not only false, since it is not really our own, but handed to us, but in addition, it shapes what we seek in life, and it shapes our hopes and fears. in terms of its implicit and local incentives and disincentives. Those dominate our mind and our life, and they also miss the mark of what life can really offer. This is a type of understanding that leaves us blind to our true advantage. So the moral and psychological problem, as Spinoza envisions it, is that we know not what we do. Perhaps we also prefer not to know what we're doing. As Plato said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Both our thinking and our actions, when they arise from this kind of unreflective and uncritical passivity, don't fulfill us, and they often harm others. Think of the unreflective nature of prejudice, based on negative stereotypes that we might initially accept because those are the views of those around us, even the views of some of those we love and respect. Spinoza himself brings up the example of prejudice to illustrate what he's talking about. He knew all about prejudice, for he was a descendant. He was the descendant of Spanish and Portuguese Moranos who had been persecuted by the Inquisition and generations of rulers in the Iberian Peninsula for their Jewish religion for hundreds of years, and forced to live in secret and in fear of discovery, which would have resulted, and did result for many, in being put to death, burned alive by auto da fe in the public square. You can still see some of those locations where they actually list them in the Iberian Peninsula. And of course, on the other hand, Spinoza was also, in a sense, persecuted by the Jewish community, having been excommunicated at the age of 24. And we don't know the exact details. We don't know why. It's a kind of standard document rather than a specific document. But some scholars think that what he did was he was teaching the bar mitzvah boys that there was no afterlife. They think that may have been what he did. And they gave him money. They wanted to give him money to go to Brazil, and he refused. And he loved the theater. He refused to go to Brazil. And he loved the theater, and he went to the theater one day, he was very thin, and he was wearing a cloak. And apparently the Jewish community sent someone to assassinate him, and they went through the cloak, but they didn't get him. And when people would come to see him, he would hold up the cloak with the with the slit in it from the knife. Okay, little aside. All right, so he was pessimistic about human nature to some extent, or perhaps very realistic. But his answer was not, even though he was influenced by Hobbes and knew Hobbes, his answer was not authoritarianism, but quite the opposite. He was one of the first advocates of a very, very far-reaching democracy in modernity. And pluralism, and religious pluralism. He's an advocate of religious pluralism. Okay, so the basic type of cognition of the passive mind operates according to the laws of mental association. Today, many of Spinoza's laws of mental association have been borne out by the new brain sciences and are captured in the neuroscience idiom, neurons that fire together, wire together. Our personal experiences and social, cultural, political, historical, geographical location shape and etch into our brain patterns and pathways encoded in images. These images link together self and experiences in the world, along with the reflective ideas, and also at best self-reflective ideas too, that provide rudimentary causal explanations. They explain our world to us. Through these, we construct interpretations of ourselves and of our world. Yet mental association is not the whole story. For we not only have a cognitive problem, we have an emotional and motivational one. That's why he calls his book The Ethics. We desire the wrong things that are more often to our detriment than to our benefit, and things that hurt other people. That is because we have a basic desire for survival, that's good, and self-furthering, these are our hopes. And we also have fears. And hopes and fears are useful and important, but they can go bad. The problem is that this basic desire makes us prone to what we would call today disavowal or denial. For Spinoza points out, quote, "The mind is averse to thinking of things that diminish our sense of power and our feeling of pleasure. We could say today that it's like an addiction. It offers fleeting pleasures now that distract us from uncomfortable truths down the road. Yet these motivations can dominate our very self. The urge to survival and self-furtherance he calls our conatus. And everything alive has one, not just humans." And I just want to do an aside about the neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp here, who is the founder of affective neuroscience, the neuroscience of the emotions. And he has found 7 basic emotions that are homologous in all mammals. And the most significant one, the central one, is the seeking system. And he says that's Spinoza's conatus. He told me that. So Spinoza's been, and of course it is what we think of in evolution as the competitive urge, or cooperative. It's for survival. Panksepp, okay. So our human mind is inherently corruptible, since it prefers pleasurable ideas about ourselves and our world, ideas that put ourselves in a positive light, and ideas that allay our fears and seem to support our hopes. And it prefers those ideas about ourselves to truth. We would rather believe pleasurable lies than painful truths about ourselves and about our family, our friends, our country, folks like us, and about our world, and of course also about the earth and about the universe. We certainly don't want to believe that we have endangered our human future through our actions. That's a double whammy. Number one, we don't want to believe our worlds are in danger. That's scary. And number two, we don't want to have a self-concept that reveals to us ourselves to be earth-destructive and self-destructive. So those are ideas that we want to push out of our minds, and we are all too prone to do that, to our own terrible danger. Yet Spinoza insists that this unreflective way of being in the world is also something, we prefer those things, but he says they're also a form of slavery. So the problem with in other words, we are enslaved to wanting to believe things that are untrue and that will get us in the end. So the problem with our naive understanding of self and world is that it is not innocent, but it is instead a form of what's called today motivated belief. That is, we believe what we wish were true about ourselves and about our world and about people we think are like us. That's, remember, Colbert's truthiness. And also at the same time, and this is another downside, it is a form of uncritical submission to the powers that be. When we put our basic desire for survival and furthering ourselves, feeling good about ourselves, together with our cognitive passivity, that is, our dependence on the external determination of our beliefs by our immediate local settings, what we get is conformity, submission to the powers that be and to the group to get from them pleasurable beliefs about ourselves as well as our own practical advancement. That's Spinoza's slavery. It's what you need to get rid of to be free, or slave mentality. And we all as human beings, he says, are prone to it. We are prone to be acutely emotionally invulnerable to our environment, to its hierarchies and groups, and hence also emotionally volatile to its ups and downs, its likes and dislikes, opinions and values. One can discern in Spinoza's analysis of human passivity the origin of the fanaticism that Spinoza laments in his theological political treatise where he writes, quote, people are all too often prone to fight for their own servitude as if it were their own salvation. He further remarks that so does fear drive men insane. The problem is that what Spinoza calls the common order of nature leads us to tie ourselves to pursuing our survival and especially our ambitions by conforming to the arbitrary, unstable, and even manipulative local world. Its leaders and peer groups, those that wield power and control over our lives through raising our hopes and manipulating our fears. Even our ambitious attempt to dominate our local worlds is not the answer, because to dominate them, one has to play the game and win at the game, a game shaped by the incentives they impose on us, and that's slavery. So Spinoza has diagnosed the fundamental human problem and condition as psychic social bondage that makes us unable to think straight about our lives, about what is the truly beneficial and fulfilling life. He has investigated with great depth and rigor why this is so, and he's also come up with a solution or a remedy. And that's how we get to the freedom and virtue of self-reflection. Freedom has now come on the horizon, for with the knowledge that we are beholden to our immediate local world, its leaders and peer groups, and how our understanding of the world is derived from its hold over us, driving, shaping, and also corrupting our pursuits, we can now begin to discern whence a solution might arise. If it is the external world that is holding us hostage, it is the internal world that will set us free. If it is our myopic localism, our groupiness, I call it, that has placed the stranglehold of our immediate world upon us, then it is the self-reflective and self-critical operations of the mind in reconfiguring our experience in terms of the infinity and universality of nature, that is, in terms of deeper and broader understandings of ourselves in fuller context, and with the benefit of psychological and other bodies, scientific bodies of understanding, that will set us free. So it is disciplined self-reflection and understanding of ourselves within the largest contexts, those we now realize have given rise to us, which become the source of our salvation. They can resolve both the passivity and localism that drive our servitude, as Spinoza understands it. We can discover the true explanation for things, for ourself and our world, in actively retracing the causes of our singular biographical experiences, as well as of our historical and biological inheritances, as products of their causes to infinity. That is, in terms of bodies or fields of science and historical explanation. We, and everything else too, are products of history and scientific laws from infinity to infinity. That insight releases us from the ongoing pain and anxiety that the death grip of the local milieu, its institutions, rules, incentives, and disincentives, exert upon our emotions, hopes, and fears. We can thereby be released from the chokehold that narrow and provincial contexts have upon our motives and goals and our very sense of self. In addition, paradoxically, by tracing and reconstructing the causes of our singular selves in this way, we begin to develop for the very first time a true first-person perspective. That perspective helps to explain our actual and unique personal experiences, rather than being caught in a set of common attitudes and explanations, which are societal, cultural, familial, we would say political in this season, cognitive frames that reinforce our submission and our conformity and our prejudices. It gives us a view from this very place in the universe. A universe, however, whose explanation as a whole is common to everyone. This tracing gives us a solid point of view of ourselves and of the world that cannot be easily shaken by our tendency to be corrupted by the reality-denying pleasure principle. And that understanding gives us some peace of mind. Spinoza writes that the very search for self-understanding gives us pleasure. It also makes us no longer passive to our immediate social world. But instead, we can now consciously embrace the whole universe as the true source of the survival and flourishing we yearn for. We are part of the universe, and it is within us and is us, too. It's not just outside us. We desire pleasures that do not at the same time corrupt our minds to our true benefits. Spinoza writes, among all the emotions that are related to the mind, insofar as it is active, as it is self-reflective, there are none that are not related to pleasure and desire. That means we need no longer be driven by fear, but instead act largely from joy, which was his aim. We are free to make choices from an outlook of our long-range well-being and happiness, and no longer feel driven to give in to the unexamined and unconscious incentives and disincentives of our local situations. We have become free, or at least a little freer. Furthermore, we are not only free, but also indirectly and inadvertently, we have become good. Since for the first time we have achieved a higher degree of personal integrity, and especially courage. We are incorruptible, or at least less corruptible. That is because we have, through developing a personal point of view, detached ourselves, freed our motivations from bondage to the immediate incentives of a local situation, and we have replaced them with incentives true to a new sense of self, in which we rediscover ourselves within and can now identify with a larger world, a world that gave birth to our narrow world, but is not confined to it. I could say that this is otherworldly, but really, it is infinitely worldly, rather than myopically provincial. For we have rediscovered ourselves in infinite space-time. Our very self, we would say today, has been transformed. Understanding thus reframes personal experience, making us realize ever more completely our embeddedness in this universe to infinity, and ourselves as singular expressions of the universe acting within us, creating each of us as who we are moment by moment. Moreover, it gives us a global perspective on ourselves and on our worlds that is true to our own experience, our personal experience in our body, but at the same time, it's also true to the world and to the universe as it is. In contemporary terms, Spinoza has given us a program to attain independence of mind, personal integrity, spiritual and emotional peace, courage, and global concern and responsibility. So, becoming at home in the universe as well as in our skin. So our fundamental biological urge for survival is bidirectional, producing both internal coherence and at the same time integration into a progressively larger reality and universe. It is our own in two respects, in the sense that it provides us with a unique perspective true to each of us alone, because it's the causes of who we are and how we became who we are that we're tracing. And each of us can develop this understanding only for oneself. That power to develop one's own unique understanding of oneself within the largest possible context, through self-reflection and world understanding, produces what Spinoza regards as independence of mind. That is, as far as we know, our uniquely human freedom. It is the only power we have to enhance and the strength and scope of our ability to shape the world, he says. The achievement of this perspective leads us both to a sense of well-being and peace, and also to acting within a wider world, at full throttle, to benefit both self and world as best we know how. Each of us is a single juncture, a unique point in the network of causes that make up the whole universe. When we understand and reconstruct our uniqueness in this way, we are also playing out our biological nature to its inherent end. And in this understanding of who each of us really is in this universe, we now act in the light of this knowledge at our highest level of functioning. We realize that our mind is as natural as our body, which is one of Spinoza's great insights. Our mind is as natural as our body. And so the well-functioning of the mind in this way is a biological phenomenon whose inherent natural aim and fulfillment is self-reflection. More accurately, body and mind, Spinoza also, and another one of his great insights, body and mind are not two things. Body and mind are one thing seen from two perspectives. And hence, human flourishing is a mind-body engagement. Thus, Spinoza's understanding of the power of the mind enables each of us to free ourselves to varying degrees from the ongoing pain of pasts passively shaped and even corrupted by the incentives of narrow provincial worlds, from the tyrannies and agonies of memory, their constitutive shaping of and power over our emotions and motives, our intimate emotional selves and settings, through recasting ourselves via a process of vigorous and disciplined self-reflection that captures the true contours and scope of each self within its history, nature, and universe. And Spinoza concludes, we feel and know by experience that we are eternal. We discover ourselves at this point in the interlocking webs and networks of causes to infinity as both truly unique selves and true to our unique experience and body, and hence personal point of view, while at the same time we recognize that we, like all other things large and small, are made up of stardust and result from the causal connections of the whole universe, from time immemorial to time eternal. Duration is taken up into eternity. Seeing ourselves in the world and the world within us reinvigorates our pursuits in wider domains that we now realize have become our own. Our motives towards others have been transformed from instrumental, turning ourselves into pretzels in order to seek ourselves positively reflected in other people's eyes, to benevolent and responsible. Spinoza writes, the good which every person who pursues virtue aims at for oneself, he will also desire for the rest of humankind, and all the more as he acquires a greater knowledge of oneself and humankind. The self-awareness that our desires and even our sense of self are shaped by our beholdenness to local and provincial worlds, their elites and peers, their understandings and beliefs, directing our motives and ambitions toward narrow and ephemeral interests rather than encouraging us to identify with universal or even just terrestrial survival and flourishing is a wake-up call. So now I'll turn to the new brain sciences just very briefly to make the case that Spinoza was right. And I'll begin with a brief section called The Self Beyond Itself, the title of my book. The weight of neurobiological and other discoveries is pushing us toward the realization that the boundaries of the self, as Spinoza anticipated, can and generally do extend beyond the scope of the body. We should begin to look not inside the individual and to individual genetic endowment and personal preferences when we want to understand people and ourselves, but rather outside, into the environment, to the way individuals and local contexts are co-constructed. The person and the local environment must be understood together. And our self-reflection brings us to a point where the larger context and the person must be understood together. For the self is permeable and relational, as well as self-promoting, self-protective, and self-furthering, rather than closed, discrete, and playing out of its own internal program upon the world stage. Neurological body maps, for example, extend the me to include the hammer I use when I put the picture on the wall, or the car when I'm driving. That's an amazing thing, that the little maps inside our head, my pen becomes mapped into my body, my neurological maps. The neuroscientist of the emotions, Antonio Damasio, contends that we incorporate extended biographical and cultural aspects of the self within the neural self maps that give us the moment-by-moment feeling tone of our bodily experience and also of our body's feeling state as a whole. So again, it looks like Spinoza is correct that we in the local milieu are absolutely fluidly interconnected, and that we introduce it into ourself as a sense of self, and we introduce the world becomes part of the self, and the self becomes part of the world, and that's both the problem and the solution. Environmental situations and self-responses are paired and etched together, and also amassed and etched into the neural self-maps over time. Meanings and feelings are brought together as well. In this way, we discover the world within ourselves, and we find ourselves being built up as world-related, locally world-related, but optimally, universally world-related. We also discover ourselves beyond itself and located in the world in our contexts, in the groups, projects, institutions we become part of and identify with. Neurophilosophers have begun to explore the phenomenon of what they call distributed agency, which refers to a subject of action that is larger than an individual. Sometimes an actor doing an action is actually a group. How radically we can have a sense of self that's located in the world has been shown by some experiments on out-of-body experiences. The neuroscientists and philosophers Olaf Blank and Thomas Metzinger's research on out-of-body illusions show that we can locate the feeling of self as coming as if from a body outside our own physical body, like those experiments where they show where people have had these experiences of thinking that they leave their body and they're up in the sky or something like that. In any case, they've reproduced some of those feelings in people. Many of us may recall seeing on TV the fake hand experiment, that an experimenter attaches a fake hand to someone's hand. They put their hand like this, and the hand is that, and then someone goes and bangs it with a hammer, and the person flinches and actually feels something. It's very interesting. The scientific explanation of how these subjective experiences come about has something to tell us about the nature and boundaries of the self, about what a self is and what it is not, and what the feeling of self actually can tell us about ourselves. We learn that the nature and scope of the self is flexible and permeable, and even capable of being relocated. The feeling of self is a mental capacity that can be projected inward, but also outward into the world. It is a feeling of ownership, of selfiness, I call it, and it is malleable and expandable. We make parts of the world feel like self, and we fill our feeling of self with our engagements in the world. One of my students has illustrated this point by mentioning how we identify with our family, and even especially our race or ethnicity, especially if we're from a minority group, and hence feel the onus of having our successes or failures reflect upon others like us. And I could go on with the chemistry of the self beyond itself, but I'll just mention briefly mirror neurons, which you may have heard quite a bit about. Mirror neurons are about shared action, emotion, and understanding. I'll continue with a comment about the recent discovery of mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are an action, observation, execution matching system. Scientists invented the term mirror neurons to describe a set of brain cells that fire both when we are motivated to do an action and do it, and also when we see someone else doing that action, but are not ourselves doing it. The mirror system enables not only joint action and agency, but a form of immediate understanding of other people's actions, goals, and emotions. In understanding others' actions and emotions, we reproduce them inside ourselves, minus the actual execution. So we understand other people from the inside out. Our minds in action and in motivation can be joined in shared emotion and joint action. I will just mention a couple more things. There are new studies of emotional infection, which follow the same mathematical patterns as infectious diseases. A new study out. And finally, I'll just say something about complex adaptive systems. The computer scientist Merlin Donald argues that although decision-making seems to be a very private thing, individualized, personal, confined to our own brain, when it is looked at from systems theory, it is not. It is often the system that often makes the decision. Donald, of course, does not deny that decisions are made in individual brains. Nevertheless, he points out that human brains are closely interconnected with and embedded in the distributed networks of culture that define the decision space. So decision-making can have a range of scopes from a part of the brain to large groups of people. Concluding thoughts. That the self is fundamentally beyond itself, and I've talked so much in this talk about how it's located in the immediate local milieu, and that is both problematic but can be expanded. That the self is fundamentally beyond itself means that nearly all of us are fundamentally social and make choices and decisions as the social beings we are, as who and where we are. It is our investment in others and the world that informs our choices, decisions, and actions, both unconscious and automatic, but also often rational and thought out. We locate our basic biological sense of self-preservation and self-furthering, our conatus, in a self distributed beyond our skin into our environments, natural and human. That is why we care about the world and why it is the arena of our concern. Nevertheless, our self beyond itself is our great human weakness, as I have been arguing in this talk, as well as our source of strength. Our local sociality, the local world relatedness that etches itself into and shapes our neuroplasticity into patterns of belief and interpretations, of loyalty and self-furthering, can be a curse as well as a blessing. The power of self-reflection, however, can be recruited to transform our narrow group motives outward so that we embrace all others and all nature because they are now recognized as sources of the self and especially also as vital to the self. So through self-reflection, our sense of self can be expanded infinitely outward to include all others and to include the earth itself, for we now know that we stand or fall together. Spinoza issues a warning at the end of the Ethics. The personal, moral, psychological transformation put forth in the Ethics as the source of a fulfilling life for each of us and of survival for the human species may be capable of accomplishment by only those individuals who take it upon themselves to follow the rigorous and arduous path of self-reflection. For he says, all things noble are as difficult as they are rare. Yet, in the good society, one that supports the human future and our long-term survival on this planet, we might all, even without every single one of us dedicating ourselves to a fully committed self-reflective practice, nevertheless be set on the way. For with a growing common understanding of our place in nature, of our very naturalness as the mind bodies we are, on and of this earth, from stardust to stardust, all human beings can and must work together as one mind and one body, as Spinoza put it, to ensure a human future that extends as far and as long as we can envision within the infinity of the immeasurable vastness of the universe that we call home. Thank you.
So that was amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Ravven, and I'm hoping you'll take some questions. And there's what I'm going to ask, if people don't mind, if you're able, if you get up and just use the mic so that everyone can hear, partly so that we can record it, but largely so that everyone can hear the question. Heidi, I didn't ask you, do you want to take your own questions, or I'll stand here and help you?
Great, thank you. Yeah. You warned me.
I'll be nice. I have two questions, one serious and one maybe not quite so serious. The serious one has to do with the relationship between freedom and free will. Now, freedom, as I see it, exists in at least two forms: political liberty, which, as you correctly pointed out, was a point of contention between Spinoza and Hobbes, and freedom as tantamount to free will. Now, I would define free will as the natural ability of a living thing to act as an originative or self-directed cause in the world. And given that definition, I think that what you're describing in terms of neuroscience, neurophysiology and whatnot, is not so much an action of free will or an action which some observers might refer to as free will, but you're describing the physical infrastructure of free will, the mechanics by which free will works. And you and I have had this discussion before. We've agreed to disagree, that I believe in free will and you don't. Okay, fine, that's all right. But given that, I just want to read you the last two sentences of your book.
Uh-oh.
And I want you to explain to me how you can write these two sentences and yet not believe in free will. Let's see, where are we? We can popularize ideas that support a new moral vision of freedom and joy for all individuals. Our default localism and provincialism can be socially, politically, and environmentally challenged and broadened and scientifically informed to bring out the best in us and also point the way to greater freedom for all. Okay, that's my serious question. My not quite so serious question concerns a paper that I gave in Copenhagen in 1998 at the University of Copenhagen on Kierkegaard. And I was very critical of Kierkegaard, who of course lived in Copenhagen. And that felt really good, just to go right to the heart of the beast and dump on Kierkegaard. And here you are in a Roman Catholic university touting Spinoza, and I was just wondering how you feel about that.
That's very nice. Well, I cleverly didn't bring up the issue of free will. I tried to do it without addressing it, right? But sort of backhand. All right. Instead of a notion, I'm glad that you defined it the way you did, because that's exactly the position that I challenge. And the way that you defined it as a person, as a unmoved mover, as an originator of themselves or their action in some substantial way, if not completely, okay? And what I'm trying to show, and certainly in a Spinoza's vein, and perhaps with the added help of neuroscience, is that we are always contextual. We are always jointly contextual. In other words, internal environment and external environment completely define us always. But what we can do, we cannot choose to be different. We can learn to be different. In other words, we have opportunities to learn things about ourselves, and everything we do, everything we learn changes us and changes our networks. So that's always happening. Now, if you want to say, yeah, but, isn't that free will? I would say some of us, it all goes back in the end to the luck of the draw. Some of us have the opportunities to do that. Some of us have learned about Spinoza. Some of us have learned about neuroscience. Some of us have learned all kinds of stuff. Some of us have lives that are really terrible and are very limited. So some of us are very lucky to have had opportunities to expand our understanding of ourselves in our world, and of ourselves in our world, which is our sense of self, and some of us don't. And so what can change are interpretations, but not willed interpretations, learned interpretations. So that's the first thing. It's interestingly enough, and it's very important to point this out, Catholic universities are very wonderful at history of philosophy, and as you very well know, one of the places that one can really study deeply Spinoza, for example, at Marquette, which has a wonderful, and at Boston College, and Hegel. Are Catholic universities, which carry on this wonderful tradition of history of philosophy, rather than just trying to reinvent the wheel out of from free will and whole cloth. Okay.
Thank you. Other questions, please. Whether or not you have free will, please. By one way or another, freely or not, please do join us. Professor Keene doesn't need more of an invitation than that. So.
I don't have free will over that, you see. Thank you, Heidi. Every time I get exposed to Spinoza, I feel that I've been cleansed somehow, so I appreciate that. When you were talking about stardust at the end, and many, many other things that you said, a passage came into my mind in Malraux, a character who is accompanying Nietzsche after he's had his breakdown, Walnut Trees of the Altenburg, and he's going back with Nietzsche, who of course loved Spinoza, the only idealist philosopher he could stomach, and he just thought he was the most rare and sublime spirit. And like Spinoza, Nietzsche did not believe in free will in the sense that we're discussing it. But the passage, it's a character named Walter Berger, I think, and it's something like, it's just a sentence, but it's beautiful, and it connects to all this, I think. And the line is something like, the wonderful thing, or what is wondrous, is not that we have been flung at random amid the wilderness of the stars and so forth, but that within this prison we can form images of ourselves powerful enough to deny our nothingness. I mean, it's somehow beautifully, almost poetically, bridges the gap. And the only other thing I'll say, aside from, you really packed, as Jennifer said, you packed an awful lot into a short talk, and it was luminous, I thought. But I do read Spinoza often sometimes through Nietzsche, but more through the Romantics, Wordsworth and Coleridge. Coleridge really understood Spinoza reasonably well. Wordsworth picked it up secondhand and turned it into great poetry. But this business of the inner and the outer and the self getting beyond the skin out to others and the community and finally the world, that's the heart of Romanticism, really, to project out in that way. It's an internal thing, and we project out. And I think that they learned more from Spinoza than he was a pantheist kind of thing, you know. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I would want to remind you that Novalis called him that God-intoxicated man, right?
Okay. Other questions, comments, reservations? Okay.
Yeah. Heidi, I really enjoyed that. That was really wonderful.
Thanks so much, Susan.
And this is a question out of pure ignorance. Does Spinoza define self-reflection, or is it a sort of intuitive thing that happens?
Well, that's very interesting. He says that the only power of the mind is self-reflection, the self-reflexivity of the mind, to think, of course, about the world, but also about the self. But for him, you're always thinking about the self when you're thinking about the world, because you're thinking with a self about the world. So what was the other part of your question? I'm sorry, repeat it.
Whether he has a definition of it,
Oh,
or
I see. Right. He has a rigorous method in the ethics of, and what it really amounts to is it is identifying all of one's very specific emotions and finding the causes of those emotions, both in terms of bodies of psychology, what we would call today anthropology, sociology, and also one's personal experience. So in other words, what one does is identify one's precise emotions, which he catalogs, and then goes through a process of bringing to bear upon those experiences and the emotions one's had in them bodies of scientific and historical explanation, so that they become integrated into the understanding of the emotion as well. Because for Spinoza, an emotion is a feeling and a cognition and a relation. Emotions always have objects, and they're connected to those objects, so they are a relation, and they're not just an internal feeling. They are and they're bodily. They are a mind-body state, and every emotion is either a mind-body state in which one is in which one's capacity to act, one's capacity to be at full throttle, so to speak, is either enhanced or diminished. And the aim is to always enhance it, but not enhance it in ways that are corruptive, getting pleasure, which gives you a little bit of enhancement, a sense of self, but then, of course, is destructive to self and others. Okay.
Sure.
Great, thank you, Heidi.
Thank
you for saying silly question, because I've got a silly question too. But in
That was not silly.
in the humanity of things, when you talk about the lack of honesty and feeling good about ourselves, does the corollary work about feeling bad about ourselves? Because it would seem to me that there are more people who feel bad about themselves. In the same way, the focus is always on the over-developer. But what about the underdeveloper? Like, is there a problem with an underdeveloper? Are we all the same in both of those respects?
Right. Interestingly enough, thank you so much, Basil. It's such a good question. Interestingly enough, Spinoza does not laud humility. He wants people to grow and to expand, but expand with others, not against others. So he is perhaps, in terms of his catalogs of virtues, he does not count humility a virtue. But he does count seeing oneself in the full context of virtue, which is also perhaps another way to see humility in a more realistic sense. But actually, he likens the person who is perhaps depressed or diminishes the self with the arrogant person, and thinks that they have some of the same emotional tendencies to denigrate others and to feel envy. So he sees the downside. So his view of it is that one should take joy, and the joy is the enhancement of oneself, but not at the expense of others, but with others, as one comes to understand one's commonality with others and with the world, rather than in competitive striving. Thanks.
I'm conscious of how intensely Professor Ravven has been thinking for the past hour. So I'd like to suggest that maybe we'll take a final question, and then we can have some then we'll break up and have some more informal conversation with Professor Ravven. But do we have someone who'd like to ask a final question? Okay, go ahead.
In the spirit of the day, what would Spinoza say about politics and our political...
Well, I think he would have something to say, because I think that he illuminates very much this whole issue of these kind of tribal groupings and how our views come out of these tribal groupings. And he would not find it an accident that certain parts of the country go in one direction and other parts go in another. In other words, we don't make our own decisions all that well. We make decisions, but the interpretation of reality is handed to us more than we realize. And he wrote a whole book on this topic called The Theological Political Treatise, and he wrote it. He wrote it because democracy was under threat in the Netherlands under the De Witt brothers, and he took off 5 years during the writing of the Ethics between between part 3 and part 4. The last 2 parts, I guess, he wrote after 5 years, to write this book because he was so concerned about doing everything he could to save democratic processes and liberty in the Netherlands. So he was extremely concerned about fanaticism, and especially about the kind of ISIS fanaticism, because after all, he also grew up during the 30-year war between Spain and Holland. Netherlands had just become free from Spanish domination, and that's why Jews were able to flee to the Netherlands. And so he was so concerned that this was not a matter of Catholics or Protestants or Jews. It was a matter of everybody has these tendencies and the fanaticism of groups. And that's what he was, and therefore, perhaps he wrote the first political theory in which there's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. And interestingly enough, he used as the model of that the ancient biblical commonwealth, interestingly enough, because he felt that it was a democratic institution, or in principle, that could encompass, and had a basic ethic in the Ten Commandments that could encompass all different kinds of people and all different religions. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you again, Professor Ravven. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to say talk to a couple of